When you're becoming a developer, at some point you have to accept that you cannot use a graphical tool for everything. In fact, it's generally expected that you know how to use a command line interface. In the beginning, it might feel very daunting to start command line interface tools. It feels like there's not a lot of support and you just have to know what's going on. But it's not that hard to get started. The best way to get started is to just get an arsenal of a couple commands that you are becoming familiar with, and 90% of the commands that you're using are going to be the same handful of commands. So today we're going to cover the basics of using command line interfaces. But first and foremost, let's talk about the terminology. You'll hear people use the term shell. So what is shell referring to? Well, currently, the shell that I have here is called bash. So what a shell is doing is it's interacting with the operating system. When you want to do something such as copying a file, that's a very complicated thing that's going on inside of the operating system. But the shell takes the command that you're using and translating it into something that the operating system knows what is. The term terminal generally refers to the program that you're using to write the command in. Currently, the terminal I'm using is called console. So console and bash are not the same thing. I could be using many different programs to be interacting with bash, which is interacting with the operating system. I just happen to have the preference of using console. If you're on a Windows machine, probably you're using command prompt. If you're on a Mac, it's probably going to be called terminal. The shell for a Mac, for instance, is called C shell, which is very similar to bash. That's why a lot of the commands that you're using for all of these different systems, they happen to be the same abbreviations. There are some differences, but generally speaking, if you have a little arsenal of commands here, then you are well on your way. So before you even get to this point, how do you open up a terminal? Well, on Mac, you can just use Spotlight, or you can go into your applications and then you find the terminal application. And then it should look something like this. On a Windows, you press the Windows key and then you search for CMD. Then inside of the suggestions, when you write CMD, you should get a program called command prompt. And that should also look very similar to this. If you're on Windows, I do recommend that you actually use PowerShell. And that's because PowerShell has a lot of aliases that translate into what other shells are doing. So for instance, the first command we'll just get to right away is listing the contents of the current directory. If you're using command prompt, again, you shouldn't do that. It will be dir, but if you're on PowerShell, it is ls. And for virtually all shells in the world, it will be ls. So if you're on a Mac, this works. If you're on Linux, it works. If you're on PowerShell on Windows, this works. So that is the first command, that is listing the current directory contents. And now we'll also get to the first tip, because if you are using a command, there will be flags you can add to this command. So ls is not just ls. Let's say you have a file in this directory that starts with a dot. By default, files that start with dot will not be shown with ls. But if you're using ls and then a hyphen and an a, this will, for most shells, reveal directories and files that start with a dot. And it's the same command, but you're just adding an option to this command. If you want to see all of the options that are for commands, most commands, they have some kind of help interface that you can look at. So if you write a -- help, you'll see all of the documentation for the command. So ls is not just ls. You can add things to ls. So let's say that you want to show things recursively, or you want to leave out some stuff. You can use some flags to do that. And now I'll get to the second command, which is very handy now that we have a wall of text, and that is clear. And then the third command is cd. cd stands for change directory. When you use cd, you add in a second argument, which is the directory that you want to jump into. So I, for instance, have a directory called source. it's called src, managing source. So now I'm inside of that directory. And if I ls in here, I see some stuff that I have in there. If I write dot instead of the folder name, I will now go back one step. So now I'm back to my home directory here. So this is how you navigate. Recall that the file system on a computer is a tree, so there can be many directories inside of the current directory that you're in, but there will always only be one parent directory. So this is just navigating a tree. The fourth command that you should know is mkdir. And mkdir makes a directory. So if I make a directory called ABC, I can now go into ABC. The fifth command that you should know is the cp command. The cp command copies. So you will add 2 arguments this time. And now the first argument is what you want to copy. And the second argument is the destination of what you're trying to copy. So if I go into source here, I'm just using tab to autocomplete. So if you write M here and you happen to have a directory that starts with M, tab will just autocomplete it. So I have, for some reason, a nested directory called Moodle inside of Moodle where I have some files here. And let's say that I want to move this file here, 24sys2.html, and one directory back. I would write cp and then 24sys2 and then ... So if I enter this and go back now, I'll see that now I have it here. I can remove it again by using the 6th command, which is rm. So that just stands for remove. So rm for removing, and then the argument here is just the file that you want to remove. You can also remove directories, but then you have to recursively remove for Bash and C Shell, which is on Linux and macOS. You will have rf like this, and then the directory. When you use rmrf, you should be very careful. Preferably, when you insert the directory that you will need to remove recursively, you should start with a dot and then dash. That indicates it starts from the current working directory. If I have a directory called usr here, and I accidentally do like this without a dot, then it's gonna remove the user directory on my computer. I would greatly appreciate to avoid that. So starting with a dot always. And last but not least, there are some etc. commands that you probably will be using at some point. Windows users, you should know about the start command. Start will open up a file, and if you have a file like a txt file, then whatever you have designed your version of Windows to open up txt files with, it's just going to open up that program with that file. On macOS, the equivalent would be open. So if I want to open up like a Moodle and then some file like this, maybe it will open up my browser because this is an HTML file. So it's probably going to recognize that this is associated with the browser. If you are on Linux, the equivalent is xdg open, and then you can open up some directory, and it's going to just take the file explorer that you're using. So as a developer, of course, a lot of the commands you'll be using are subject to whatever development environment you're using. So if you're a JavaScript developer, you're probably going to be using commands like npm a lot. If you're a C# developer, you're probably going to be using the command .NET Run or something like that a lot. But at least having the possibility to navigate the file system more comfortably makes a big difference in your day-to-day life. So with that being said, it doesn't mean that graphical tools are no good. Sometimes you might prefer using a graphical tool for something specific. I know a lot of people, they don't like the Git CLI because the Git CLI doesn't give them a good graphical overview of what's going on. But it's very nice to at least have maybe 5, 6, 7 Git commands memorized. So yes, a graphical user interface is a tool and a CLI is a tool. You shouldn't hate on either of them. They're just ways of getting your job done. But probably you will need to be at least a little bit comfortable with using a command line interface.